Welcome everyone to my YouTube channel. If you find it interesting, please give me a like and a subscription. Here is the short story, Faith Collapse. When I was in 8th grade, my parents divorced. My mother dragged her suitcase out of the house, saw me standing at the door looking around and said, "Your Uncle Tan doesn't like children, I can't take you." After my mother left, my father also took my younger brother with him. He didn't say a word, not even looking at me once. After my father left, I heard the neighbors gossip. Luvin Sin is really a pitiful person. His wife went to a class reunion and then left him for someone else. Tunyan also had it hard, giving birth to 2 children, taking care of them all by herself, her husband working far away all day, no one to help. Both parents are pitiful, only I, abandoned by them, am not pitiful. After they left, I hid in the house alone. When it was almost dark, I cooked a bowl of noodles, added soy sauce and ate it. The noodles were bland, mixed with my tears, creating a bitter taste. I didn't dare to choose because there was only one last handful of noodles left in the house. While I was eating the bowl of noodles, someone knocked on the door. A man in a black suit stood at the door and said, "Little boy, your father sold this house to us, you can't stay here anymore." I was embarrassed, my parents didn't need me anymore, this house was the only place I had, I couldn't lose it. I slammed the door shut, blocking the person outside. The person started kicking the door, cursing profanely. Hearing the noise, the neighbors came to see, seeing the sales contract in the man's hand, they started knocking on the door to help him. "Mo, quickly open the door, this house, your father really sold it, it doesn't belong to your family anymore." I didn't believe it, opened the door angrily, grabbed the contract from the man's hand, threw it on the ground, stomped on it twice, and loudly said to him, "This is my house, you guys get lost." The man slapped me hard in the face. I immediately felt my ears ringing. The man wanted to hit me again, but was stopped by the neighbor. He cursed a lot, but the words, "You dog, you mongrel," made my heart ache. I opened my mouth and bit his hand hard. The man kicked me, I fell to the ground, and was punched and kicked by him. The neighbor couldn't stop me, and quickly called the police. The police came and took us away. After investigating the cause, they detained the man. Afterwards, the policeman saw my body covered in bruises and asked, "Little boy, do you still remember your parents' phone number? Call them to pick you up and take you home." I shook my head. "It's okay, if you don't remember, where did your parents work, what are their names?" I raised my head, the handprint clearly on my face, looked at the policeman and said, "Uncle, my parents are dead. My parents don't need me, it's no different from being dead." That's what I thought. The policeman looked at me with sympathy. After investigating, they knew I was lying, but they also knew that my parents had abandoned me. They took me to the medical room, bandaged my wounds, then looked at my household registration information and found my grandfather in the far north. Early the next morning they sent a special car to take me there. My grandfather's house was very far away, the policeman's car drove for 6 hours to get there. In front of a bungalow, the policeman stopped the car and handed me over to an old man. He said to the old man, "Sunwon, this is your grandson, please take good care of him." After taking me there, the policeman left, leaving me and my grandfather staring at each other. Only then did I timidly raise my head and glance at the old man in front of me. His face was thin and long, his eyes were determined, his wrinkles were deep, and a scar as long as a centipede crossed his right cheek, looking like a nail, making me a little scared and take a step back. But I knew that he was my grandfather, the only one who could take care of me. I mustered up all my courage, took a step forward, and softly called out, "Grandpa." Useless. My grandfather glared at me, then turned and walked into the house. The wooden door slammed shut, leaving me outside, at a loss for what to do. That night, I slept in the dog kennel. The yellow dog probably knew that I was unwanted and didn't bark once, but didn't pay any attention to me, just lying quietly in a corner of the kennel. I walked over and hugged it, feeling extremely happy, feeling that I finally had a friend, a place to shelter from the sun and wind. The torn mattress in the dog cage mixed with the strong stench rushed straight into my nose, making me sneeze continuously. But it doesn't matter. As long as I'm alive, the doghouse is a good place. That night, I hugged the dog and couldn't sleep well. I kept dreaming. In my dream, I returned to my old house. Ever since my younger brother was born, my parents often argued. The content of the arguments only revolved around money. My mother blamed my father for not having the ability, not having a degree, not having the ability, not only having to go to the south to work but also only coming back once a year, sending home $3.5 million each month, not enough for the three of us to live. The sentence my mother said the most was, "I was blind before, traveling more than 400 kilometers to marry you. If only I had married my classmate, he would be a businessman now, running his own seafood business, with 2 houses, but you're nothing, you're really useless." My father didn't argue back. Every time he was silent, taking puffs of his cigarette. After finishing smoking he would slam the door and leave, not knowing where he went, leaving my mother alone at home going crazy. After a long time of going crazy, my mother stopped arguing and even deleted my father's number. Then when she heard my little brother crying in his diaper, she rushed into the kitchen, grabbed my ear while I was washing the dishes, and angrily scolded me, "It's all your fault. If I hadn't given birth to you too, I would have divorced a long time ago. Raising 2 children is a burden. I wouldn't dare to think about it until I die. Living in this miserable situation, I've had enough." That year, I was only 6 years old. Hearing my mother cry and scold, I began to realize that I had done something wrong. Because of me, my mother was tied to this family, and she lived unhappily every day. I thought that maybe I shouldn't have come to this world. I began to understand things. I began to learn to read my mother's expression. I began to care for my mother. Whatever I could do, I would take the initiative before my mother told me to. Washing dishes, doing laundry, cleaning, taking care of my little brother. My mother wouldn't let me go to school, but I didn't dare say no, so I obediently stayed home and took care of my brother. Now I am 13 years old, I can do anything my mother can do. I thought that as long as I was obedient and understanding, my mother would be happy. But she still left. Even my father, whom I rarely saw, did not need me. I woke up sobbing. When I woke up, it was already dawn. I did not dare to sleep anymore. Just like at home, I immediately got up, brushed off the dirt on my body, and went out into the yard. I didn't cry or make a fuss, leaned against the door, rubbed my hungry stomach, then followed the dirt road up the mountain. In the past years when I was at home taking care of my younger brother, my mother had to work the night shift and come home late. I was often hungry, carrying my younger brother up the mountain behind the park to find wild fruits. I remembered clearly which fruits were edible, which grasses were edible. I was quite lucky, picked a bag of wild hawthorns and a handful of wild garlic. A handful of apples, a handful of garlic. I ate until I was full, then picked a bunch of alfalfa, carried it on my shoulder and returned home. Perhaps my grandfather didn't expect me to come back. He was carrying a couple of buckets of water, preparing to go get water when he saw me carrying the grass back. He was stunned for a moment, then didn't pay any attention, just passed me by like a stranger. Seeing that the door was unlocked, I walked into the yard, threw the grass into the pig pen, fed the yellow dog some, petted its head, then went to the stove. I took a bundle of firewood that I had chopped in the morning, stuffed it into the stove, boiled water and lit a fire, then quietly walked into the house, saw the flour and helped him knead the dough. I worked quickly, and when the dough was done, my grandfather returned. As soon as he entered, he saw me carrying the bowl of flour, and immediately shouted with a dark face, "Why don't you leave?" Knowing my identity as a dependent, I put down the bowl of flour, knelt down in front of my grandfather, and cried bitterly, "Grandfather, please let me stay. Mom and Dad don't need me anymore, but I want to grow up. When I grow up, I will be filial to you, take care of you, don't chase me away, okay?" My grandfather originally wanted to push my hand away, but suddenly relaxed, only scolding, "Just like your mother, both are useless." After saying that, he went into the yard. I happily got up, knowing that my grandfather would not chase me away, so I worked even harder, rolling out the dough, cutting the vegetables, and in a moment, I had cooked a bowl of hot vegetable noodles. I carried the bowl of noodles to my grandfather and then turned around to sweep the yard. My grandfather saw me busy as a pinwheel, and his eyes fell on the bowl of noodles in front of me. He divided the bowl of noodles in half and threw it in front of me. "Here, feed the dog." I knew that this was my grandfather feeding me, and that he had accepted my presents. I happily ran over, picked up the bowl of noodles and ate it all. After eating, I started washing the dishes and clothes again, doing everything I could. When I saw that the water jar was not full, I went to get water again. I was small and thin, and could not carry the carrying pole, so I had to carry a small bucket, bucket by bucket, running more than 10 times before I could fill the water jar. I don't know if it was because I was diligent or because the smile on my face moved my grandfather. That night he pulled me out of the dog cage. "Go inside and sleep, otherwise you'll catch a cold and waste money on medicine." That night, I slept on the dirt bed, so happy that I couldn't sleep. In the middle of the night I heard my grandfather snoring. I didn't find it noisy but felt strangely at ease. In the following days, I was like a small pinwheel, constantly busy. My grandfather had 2 acres of land. Every day I carried a hoe to work in the field. I pulled out all the grass in the field, not a single blade was left. The villagers gradually got to know me as a city kid, and started to spread bad rumors, sometimes even mentioning my mother's name. I also noticed that the villagers seemed to intentionally avoid my grandfather, as if he had a disease. They didn't like him, they didn't like me, they even pointed at my face and said I was a mongrel, a thing that even dogs don't need, just like my mother, ungrateful and disloyal. I didn't care, my life was mine, I just wanted to live well. No matter what others said, I wouldn't lose any meat, just let them be. I hoped to grow up quickly, so I wouldn't have to depend on others, and could take care of my grandfather. I was busy every day, afraid that if I was lazy, my grandfather would chase me away. More than a month later, one day my grandfather got up early, said he was going to town, and told me not to wait for him. I was busy all day, it was already dark but he still hadn't returned. I reheated the rice for him over and over again, and I started to worry. Had my grandfather left me behind too? I didn't know anyone in the village, so I took a flashlight and went looking for him myself. I walked along the asphalt road to the village gate, stood under the stone tablet, and anxiously waited for him to return. However, I waited for a long time but still didn't see him. I started to panic, and slowly started to cry. Is it because Grandpa doesn't need me anymore that he didn't come home? I blamed myself, thinking that I was the troublemaker. Whoever raised me would only bring trouble. Just when I was feeling restless, a figure staggered from the darkness, approaching with difficulty step by step. Grandpa! I recognized him immediately, ran over like a rocket, threw myself into Grandpa's arms, hugged his waist, and cried like a child, "Grandpa, do you not need me anymore?" Grandpa smiled, his rough hands wiped away my tears, and said with a chuckle, "You don't even want a dog, Grandpa doesn't need you either." I knew Grandpa was teasing me on purpose, and hugged his waist even tighter. "I don't care, I only need Grandpa, I need Grandpa." Okay, it's my bad luck, having to raise you again." He pushed me away, grabbed my hand and went home together. I felt that his legs seemed to be lame, so I asked him why, but he refused to say. I bent down to carry him, but he pushed me away, saying that he was only 61 years old, not so old that he could not walk. From the village gate to home, it was more than 1.5 kilometers. I helped him walk for 50 minutes. When we got home, I helped him sit down, took off his shoes, rolled up his pants to help him wash his feet. When I rolled them up to his knees, I saw that his knees were covered in bruises, both purple and swollen, like 2 buns. "Grandpa, what happened to your legs?" He grabbed my hand. It was dark, I accidentally fell. After saying that, my grandfather grabbed my hand, his face full of mystery. "Mac, let me show you something interesting." He took a carefully folded piece of paper from his pocket, opened it, and handed it to me. I took it and looked at it. It was a school transfer paper. I was stunned, happy and surprised. "Can I go to school now?" My grandfather smiled and nodded. I jumped up happily, hugged him, and laughed out loud. At that moment, I saw that the scar on my grandfather's face was no longer scary, and vaguely realized that he really loved me. I was so moved that I couldn't sleep all night, hugging the transfer paper tightly, afraid that it would suddenly disappear. The next morning, I got up at 3 a.m, cleaned the yard, steamed a pot of steamed buns for my grandfather, and filled the water jars one by one. I brought 6 steamed buns, put on the cloth bag he found for me, rolled up the blanket, took 20 yuan, and went to school. Before leaving, my grandfather grabbed my hand, looked at me sternly for the first time, and warned me, "Don't be like your mother, dropping out of school because of a man. You have to study properly. If I find out that you didn't study seriously when you got there, I'll break your legs." I hugged my grandfather. I said, "Grandpa, I will study hard. I will take the university entrance exam. I will buy a house. A house that belongs to me. I will study hard." No one knows, every day I carry my younger brother past the school, full of admiration and longing to go to school. My grandfather nodded and saw me off to the village gate. I only get to go home once a week from the middle school in town, and I get 1 day off each time. To make up for the knowledge I missed before, I told my grandfather, I will go home once every 2 weeks. Before we parted, I told my grandfather not to work too much, and that I would do it when I got home. I was happy to go to school. In the past 2 years, because my mother went to work and took me off school to stay home and take care of my younger sibling, I missed a lot of lessons. At school, I was immersed in books, munching on every bit of knowledge, and couldn't even remember all the names of my classmates. Every day, I only thought about how to raise my grades. During the day, I studied, and at night, I helped out in the cafeteria, washing vegetables, washing dishes, and sweeping. The aunt who worked in the cafeteria was very kind, and gave me leftover steamed buns and vegetable soup every day. When I was full, I worked even harder. Finally, after a year and 8 months of taking the junior high school graduation exam, I ranked first in the whole town and was admitted to a key high school in the city. When the results were announced, the principal called me into his office. After closing the door, he told me something that left me stunned. "Momo, your results surprised us. You should thank your grandfather. That year, if he hadn't knelt in front of the school gate all day, we wouldn't have dared to give you a transfer certificate. You know, your grandfather is a murderer. We really didn't dare to accept the child he raised." I felt like I had been struck by lightning, standing there frozen. The joy of getting first place was gone. I walked slowly back home. My mind was hazy and couldn't accept that my grandfather was a murderer. When I got to the door, I still couldn't come to my senses, unable to connect the image of the calm old man with a murderer. I also didn't understand, who did he kill, and why did he have to kill? But thinking back, he was my beloved grandfather. He knelt for me all day. Without him, there wouldn't be my achievements today. I blamed myself for doubting my grandfather, took a deep breath, tried to adjust my mood, then smiled, pretended not to know anything, and walked into the house, preparing to share the good news that I had won first place. However, when I entered the house, I found the door locked. The neighbor said to me, "Your grandfather got into a fight with someone and was arrested again. Hurry up and go find your mother, or he will be imprisoned again." I immediately felt dizzy, almost collapsing. It took me a while to calm down. I cried and went out of town, to the police station to find my grandfather. I didn't see my grandfather, but a policeman spoke to me. He said to me, "Your grandfather is suspected of intentionally causing injury. The specific situation will be determined based on the extent of the other party's injuries." I couldn't believe it. Although my grandfather looked scary, he had never hurt anyone for no reason, let alone beat someone up. "Policeman, who did your grandfather hurt?" No matter who it was, I would go and beg that person. As long as they didn't sue my grandfather, I was willing to do anything. Chin Dong. I secretly memorized the name, went to the city hospital, used the living expenses I had saved up to buy some bananas, asked around room by room, and finally found someone named Chin Dong in the orthopedic department. I carried the bag of bananas and walked in, looked at the 3 beds in the room, and stopped in front of the last bed. Because the nameplate in front of the bed clearly read, Chin Dong. I looked at the man with the cast on his leg and asked timidly, "Excuse me, are you Uncle Chin?" The man raised his head, glanced at me, and smiled, but when he saw my face clearly, his expression immediately turned cold, and his voice was sarcastic. "You're the one who doesn't need a dog, right, you bastard?" I didn't understand why he said that, but since I had something to ask for, I ignored his words and put down the banana. "Uncle Chin, please don't sue my grandfather. As long as you don't sue, I'll do whatever you want." Chin Dong sneered, "You bastard, do you know who I am?" I looked at him, really unable to think of anything. He looked at me and suddenly burst out laughing. "Your mother left me for you before." I understood. I took a step back. I also didn't call him uncle anymore. Seeing my wary gaze, he immediately became angry. "Didn't you want me to forgive your grandfather? As long as you kneel down and admit you are a mongrel, I can think about it." I picked up the bag of bananas on the table and turned to leave. When I reached the door of the ward, I bumped into a woman. "Can't you see when you walk, Momo?" I seemed to hear my mother's voice, and raised my head in surprise, seeing a familiar yellow face. My mother's face was as yellow as wax, looking like a withered banana, old and ugly. I was startled by her appearance. If it weren't for her voice, I wouldn't have recognized her. Before, she loved to dress up. Even if the family didn't have any money, she would still try to save some money and go to the wholesale market to buy cheap cosmetics. But now, her face was plain, full of wrinkles, looking like she had aged 10 years. "Why are you here?" My mother grabbed me, pulled me out into the hallway, and stared at me angrily. After more than a year of not seeing me, there was no trace of longing in her eyes. The word "mom" was stuck in her throat. She rolled over and over but couldn't say it. I also didn't want to answer her question. Mom got even angrier and pushed me. "Are you mute? You didn't even call me, you're a dog." Over the years, many people have called me a dog, but I've become immune and don't pay attention anymore. I knew why I came here. I raised my head to look at her face, both familiar and unfamiliar, and asked, "Grandpa was arrested, can you save him?" "How can I save him? He has a stubborn personality. He would start fighting after just a few words. He even killed people before." At this point, my mother suddenly stopped, took out a cigarette, quickly lit it, the flame flickered, and said a hateful sentence. "You all won't let me be at peace. It's so annoying. I'd rather just die." After she finished speaking, she took a few puffs and put out the cigarette, and went into the hospital room. I stood in front of the door, not leaving. The police officer said that if you want to save my grandfather, you have to apologize to the victim. I couldn't leave. That day, my mother went in and out of the hospital room several times. At first, she told me to go home, but then she treated me like air and didn't pay any attention to me anymore. My eyes followed her figure as she walked, until late at night, a piercing scream rang out. Realizing it was my mother's scream, I rushed into the hospital room. In the hospital room, Tan Dong was holding a thermos cup, like a hammer, hitting my mother's face. Mother's head and face were drenched, hot water was flowing down from the top of her head, still steaming. Chin Dong grabbed her hair, beating her and shouting, "You won't serve me? You think you're still the goddess from high school, I still have to revolve around you, daydreaming. You can't even give me 100,000, and you still dare to fall asleep. Don't forget that your father beat me into this state, you have to take responsibility to the end." My mother cried and begged, apologizing over and over again, admitting that she was wrong. Looking at my mother's miserable appearance, I felt something welling up in my heart. I rushed forward, pushed Chin Dong's hand away, pulled my mother back, used my sleeve to wipe the water on her face, and asked worriedly, "Mom, are you okay?" When my mother saw me, her eyebrows furrowed, her eyes cold, she pushed me away. "Get lost, it's all your fault, you damn dog." I felt wronged, felt that she was unreasonable, didn't care about her anymore, and left the hospital room. Never mind, the beating of my grandmother had nothing to do with me. I squatted in the corner of the hallway, bowed my head and hugged my knees, and started thinking about my grandfather. I wondered how he was, if he had eaten anything. That night, I slept on the couch in the hospital corridor. The next morning, I saw my mother with several bandages on her face, returning from outside with lunch. I knew she had been burned last night, but I didn't expect it to be so serious. When she passed me, she didn't even bother to glance at me and went straight into the ward. I didn't feel sad anymore. Having my grandfather care about me was enough. I stayed outside the ward for 3 days, and on the third night, I heard the nurses gossiping about Tan Dong, saying that they saw him beating his wife, and more than once, they also noticed scars on her body, and felt that he was showing signs of domestic violence, wondering if I should call the police. The person who said it was unintentional, but I heard everything. I suddenly thought of a way to save my grandfather. The next morning, I sweetly asked the nurse to borrow my phone. When my mother went out to buy rice, I went back to the ward. Chin Dong saw me, only glanced at me, and didn't pay any attention. I looked at him, trying to learn an adult's voice to discuss with him. "You beating my mother is against the law, I can sue you and put you in jail." Hearing me say that, Chin Dong immediately sneered, sat up and tried to grab my collar. While reaching out he said, "You dog, you bastard." I wasn't stupid enough to wait for him to hit me. I took a step back. After all, he had a broken leg and couldn't get out of bed. I stood at the head of his bed, raised my phone and threatened, "I have evidence. You poured boiling water on my mother's face, and even used a knife to cut her. I will send it all to the police. When the police check my mother's injuries, you will be arrested." Chin Dong's face darkened, gritting his teeth in anger. "Did your mother tell you?" I was silent. This despicable woman, she dares to harm me. Let's see if I can handle her. I didn't care about what happened between him and my mother, I just wanted to save my grandfather. I stood still, staring at him. Even though my heart was trembling with fear, I still tried not to show it. "If you write a commitment not to sue my grandfather, then I will not report you and erase all the evidence." Chin Dong didn't believe it. He would never trust a child, nor would he want to let go of his injuries. I knew what he wanted. Standing outside the hospital room for the past few days, I heard him arguing with my mother, always asking for money. It was because he urged my mother to ask my grandfather for money that he was beaten by my grandfather. I took out a piece of paper from my pocket and gave it to him. This was the paper I had just borrowed from the nurse at the counter, on which was written, "I, Liamo, voluntarily compensate Chin Dong for all hospital fees and other expenses after I grow up." At the bottom of the paper was my name and a red handprint. Chin Dong's eyes were slightly surprised. He raised his head to look at me, sneered, as if he didn't believe that this was the action of a child. "Just you?" Before coming here, I had thought it over carefully, not afraid that he wouldn't believe me. I'm 15 years old this year, and I'll be an adult in 3 years. As long as you release my grandfather, I can go to work to earn money to pay you back. If you insist on putting my grandfather in jail, I'll give the evidence of your domestic violence to the police so that you can go to jail with my grandfather." I don't know if my overly calm voice surprised him, or if my determination to report him made him waver. Qin Dong's eyes froze for a moment, then he laughed coldly, opened a drawer, took out a pen, and added another line, "and 100,000 yuan for loss of income and nutrition." After writing, he tapped the paper lightly. "You dog, remember, you owe me 100,000. In the afternoon, Qin Dong's forgiveness pledge was sent to the police station. Grandpa was released. In the lobby, I hugged Grandpa's waist tightly and cried. He stroked my hair and muttered, "You dog, why are you crying?" "I'm still fine." My grandfather knew that I had saved him and that I had gone to look for Qin Dong, but he didn't know about the 100,000 yuan debt. He sighed, "From now on, don't go looking for those two people again." I didn't like them either, so I nodded. As long as they didn't come to bother me and my grandfather, I didn't want to see them again in this life. I held my grandfather's hand and went home with him. On the way, to make him happy, I bragged that I had won first place in the entire town. After hearing this, he didn't praise me, but only frowned and told me not to be arrogant. When I got home, I hesitated, wondering whether I should tell him about my mother being beaten. After all, she was his daughter. As soon as I opened my mouth, he said, "Even if she dies out there, it has nothing to do with me. You focus on studying well and don't worry about anything else." From then on, he didn't let me do anything anymore, and urged me to study all day long, saying that high school was very hard, and I couldn't be inferior to others from the start. I started to focus on my studies. My mother was no longer mentioned at home, as if she had really died. My grandfather never even mentioned Qin Dong. Many times I wanted to ask about my grandfather's murder, who he killed and what that person did to make him so angry, but seeing his face getting older and older, I held back. Gradually, I lost my curiosity. Who cares who it is? I know, my grandfather is a good person. The person who was killed definitely deserves to die. After my grandfather was released, I went back to school. I spent the 3 years of high school in the dormitory. Unlike in middle school, I didn't have time to help in the kitchen anymore. To earn money for living, I spent a day working part-time at the internet cafe on the weekend. My grandfather worked hard to pay for my tuition. I didn't want him to be more tired. The part-time job earned 100 yuan a day, although it wasn't much, it was enough for my daily meals of steamed buns and porridge. I studied and worked part-time. My grades were always in the top 3 of the class, but I knew that wasn't enough. I had to be the best. I started to work harder, taking advantage of the evenings when the internet cafe was quiet to study vocabulary. "You're working so hard, are you planning to take the Tsinghua entrance exam?" A blonde boy leaned against the counter, watching me study in the internet cafe, his eyes sparkling with arrogance and disdain. I looked at him indifferently and asked, "Staying overnight or recharging?" He smiled and asked, "Is it okay, without an ID card?" I shook my head and pointed at the sign on the table at him, "No underage people allowed." He pointed at me, "Aren't you underage too?" I didn't answer. If I had a choice, I wouldn't want to come here either, but I need to live to have hope, to be able to pass the university entrance exam, take care of my grandfather, and repay Qin Dong the 100,000 yuan. I continued to study vocabulary, ignoring his presence. He had no choice but to glare at me a few times, mumble, "Stiff," and then leave the internet cafe. In the following days, he came every weekend, still talking to me non-stop. I kept him outside the counter. Without his papers, he wouldn't let him in. I didn't care what other people did, but since I was sitting here, I had to fulfill my responsibility, manage according to the rules on the sign. Saying no entry meant no entry. If anything happened, I couldn't take responsibility. Every time he saw me studying. If it wasn't studying vocabulary, it was reviewing knowledge from social studies. He lay on the counter, craning his neck to look at my books. "You're trying so hard, why aren't you in school? Are you poor? My dad has money, I'll sponsor you, how about that?" I looked at him, my face darkened, my voice unfriendly. "No need. I don't believe there are good things in this world without a reason. Even my own parents don't care about me, what right does a stranger have to want to help me? I don't believe that there are good things in this world without a reason. Even my own parents don't care about me, what right does a stranger have to help me? I don't believe it, and I don't want to believe it. I'd rather work hard on my own, move forward step by step, even if it's tiring, but I feel very secure." Grade 12. The school's curriculum is getting more and more stressful. Before I had 1 day off every week, now it's changed to once every half month. I don't have time to go to the internet cafe to work part-time anymore. I quit my job, planning to focus on studying wholeheartedly. In the past 2 years, the part-time income wasn't much, but I still saved $100 every month. That amount was enough for my senior year of high school. Grade 12 is extremely important, I can't waste even a second or a minute. While I was lowering my head to read a book, the homeroom teacher brought a new student into the classroom. She introduced to the class, "This is classmate Duong Loy, just transferred from school number 7, Duong Loy, you sit next to Lumac." Hearing the teacher call my name, I raised my head to look. Seeing the boy's face, I was a little surprised. "We meet again." Tang Lei sat down next to me, smiling brightly. His blonde hair had been dyed black, looking much more pleasing to the eye, but still had the same teasing look as the time I met him at the internet cafe. I didn't reply, continuing to lower my head to study. I had set a clear goal, aiming straight at Tan Hoa. No one could bother me. During the period after that, Tang Lei often asked me all kinds of questions, sometimes even during class. I was annoyed to the point of irritation, treating him like air, not paying attention. Not receiving a response from me, he just smiled and mumbled a few sentences, then fell asleep on the table again. When the bell rang, he stood up, without carrying his school bag, and just left. As he left, he would say,
"Goodbye."
To me, "See you tomorrow, little Tan Hoa." Gradually, my classmates began to gossip and rumor that we were in love. The homeroom teacher knew about my family situation, called me into the office, and said seriously, "Lumac, you have always been a good and obedient child, you cannot learn to love so early." I told the teacher, "Teacher, I am not." "You didn't, so why did Tang Lei only talk to you? One hand doesn't clap, go back and think about it. If there are still rumors like this, I'll call your parents." I left the teacher's office and returned to the classroom. I couldn't let her call the guardian, my grandfather was old, I didn't want him to worry about me. Sitting down on the chair, I lowered my head to my books, not wanting to think about anything else, continuing to study. "Lumo, what's wrong with you, are you unhappy? Who bullied you? Tell me, I'm going, can you stop talking to me?" I suppressed my anger, like an inflated balloon suddenly bursting, I shouted at Tang Lei. He suddenly stopped, looked at me in surprise, saw my eyes were red, his surprise changed to indifference. "It's just a few rumors, it's nothing." To him, it wasn't a big deal, but to me, it was a fatal blow. I wanted to change seats, but for the past few years I had only known how to study and study. My classmates all thought I was a fake person, mentally ill, no one liked me, and no one wanted to change seats with me. I could only stay away, pretend to be deaf and mute. I kept thinking that if I tried to endure for another year, everything would pass. But unexpectedly, during a physical education class, I fainted from exhaustion. It was Tang Lei who carried me to the infirmary and took care of me until I woke up. From then on, the rumors in class spread even more, all of them saying that Tang Lei and I were in love. The homeroom teacher called my grandfather. That afternoon, he rushed to school. He bowed deeply to the teacher, repeatedly apologizing, promising to teach me well. The teacher taught me a few sentences, kindly reminding me, with your grades, as long as you work hard and don't think too much, you will definitely be able to get into a famous university. Don't take the wrong path, it will be too late to regret it later. I bowed my head and replied yes. After leaving the teacher's office, my grandfather and I walked out of the school gate one after another. He didn't say anything the whole way. Looking at his hunched back, I began to feel a sense of fear. About 50 meters from the school gate, he suddenly stopped. He turned back to look at me, his eyes strange and cold. The long scar on his face, now, like ice in an ice cellar, made me shiver. Grandpa, I really didn't have any love. I hurriedly explained. The anger he had suppressed all this way finally erupted. He pointed at my head, his voice trembling and cold. You bastard. Just like your mother, you shameless thing, how good of a man can be. If you don't love, you'll die? Under the shade of the fallen leaves, my grandfather's face was filled with anger, his body trembled with anger, his eyes seemed to be burning, blowing straight at me. His voice was harsh, screaming, making my heart tremble. I didn't, Grandpa, I really didn't. I cried as I spoke, afraid that my grandfather would abandon me. But he didn't listen, raising his hand to slap me in the face. I reflexively closed my eyes, waiting for his whip. However, when the slap sounded, I didn't feel any pain. Opening my eyes, I saw a clear handprint on his face. One slap wasn't enough, he raised his other hand and slapped the other side. Grandpa, I hugged his arm, crying like a child, refusing to let go no matter what. Hit me, Grandpa, I was wrong, I will never do it again. I would rather let his slaps fall on my face. He pushed me away, turned around to wipe his tears, pointed at me, wanted to say something, his lips moved a few times, but in the end he said nothing, angrily leaving. After he left, I went back to class in a daze. Lumo, are you crying? I went to find the teacher just now and made it clear that we are just classmates, don't listen to their nonsense. The upright are not afraid of death, if you don't pay attention, then nothing will happen. I beg you, Tang Lei, can you stay away from me? You have a father and a mother, even if you do poorly in your studies, you will have people who love you, but I'm not like that. If I don't get into university, my grandfather will be so angry. I looked at him, crying and begging. Tang Lei heard me, clearly stunned, his face full of astonishment, only recovering after a while. He only said one sentence, "You're exaggerating." I didn't explain further. My life is different from everyone else's. But who would believe it? They don't know that the nagging words of my parents that they hate so much, to me, are the furthest thing, and also the thing I crave the most. My grandfather is the only light in my life, I can't lose him. From that day on, I started to become silent and stop talking. If I talk too much, I will make mistakes. If I don't talk, I won't make mistakes, right? Seeing me like that, Duong Loi didn't dare to come near me anymore. He voluntarily moved to sit in the last row. The seat next to me was empty, just like my heart, empty, only studying could fill it. I started to study hard again. In the second half of my senior year, my grades remained at the top of my class. When I entered the university entrance exam room, I walked in confidently, as if I was entering a bright future ahead. When I registered my wishes, I only listed one school, Tsinghua University. If I didn't pass Tsinghua, I would rather retake the exam. After completing the registration, I left the school. When I walked out the gate, I met Tang Lei. He was leaning against the railing of the school gate, as if he was waiting for me. Seeing me coming, he ran to me and handed me a blue notebook. Lumo, you will definitely pass Tsinghua. Thank you. I said thank you, then walked past him, not accepting the notebook he gave me. He looked at my back until I disappeared into the crowd, his eyes became sad. I went home and continued to rely on my grandfather. 18 days later, I received a package in the mail. It was an admission notice from Tsinghua University. Grandpa held the newspaper, caressed it for a long time, hugged his head and sat on the ground, crying. I didn't understand why Grandpa was so sad. Obviously getting into university was a happy thing. But hearing his miserable cry, I felt uncomfortable too. Thinking about not being loved by my parents, I sat down, hugged Grandpa, and cried with him. That night, we cried for a long time. Grandpa drank some wine, cried until he fell asleep. The next morning, while I was working in the yard as usual, my grandfather called me into the house. He took my hand, made me sit down, and then placed a thick envelope made of cowhide in my hand. I looked at my grandfather in amazement, opened it, and inside was a thick stack of money, all red bills. Grandpa, where did this money come from? I asked in surprise. My grandfather sat up a little, looked out the window where a bird was flapping its wings in the distance, and said to me, over the years, my grandfather has worked part-time and saved up 30,000, it's not much but you can take it and use it for college. I pushed it back. I don't need it, Grandpa, you keep this money and use it. I'm 18 years old, I can work part-time, and I can also apply for a student loan. I can support myself. He was a little angry, and forced the money into my hand. Why is this child so disobedient? I told you to take it, so you just take it. You're a child, how can you take care of yourself? The corners of my eyes couldn't help but get wet. Touching the money in my hand, I felt uncomfortable. My grandfather was old and still had to work hard to pay for my tuition. The more I thought about it, the sadder I became. I burst into tears, hugging him tightly and crying, refusing to let go. I didn't know if my grandfather was crying, but his voice became hoarse. He stroked my head, his voice gentle, with a hint of guilt. Mac, all these years, it was Grandpa who made you suffer. I raised my head, facing his cloudy eyes, not understanding why he said that. Grandpa, you treat me so well. If it weren't for you, I might have died on the streets when I was 13, or I might have been kidnapped. It was you who gave me a home, gave me warm love, and insisted that I study hard for a brighter future. Grandpa shook his head again, tears streaming down his face, unable to stop. It was you, Grandpa, who harmed me. From now on, I won't call you a dog anymore. You're a good kid, not like your mother. He said as he stroked my head, his eyes filled with regret. Grandpa, I like you calling me that, I don't mind. I knew there was a type of dumpling called gobiu li bao zi, dog don't even want to eat buns. Grandpa called me a dog, but it wasn't meant as an insult, completely different from other people calling me a mongrel. Hearing me say that, Grandpa buried his face in his knees and cried out loud. In the 5 years I lived with my grandfather, I had never seen him like this. I was scared, grabbed his calloused hand, and asked while crying, Grandpa, what's wrong? Is something wrong? Why did he keep apologizing to me and crying so painfully? I knew that he didn't like me at first because he was angry with my mother, so he called me a dog, but I didn't care. I knew clearly who loved me and who didn't. Grandpa cried for a while, then pretended like nothing happened, wiped his face and didn't explain anything. It's nothing, I'm old, I'm just afraid I won't be able to see you anymore. I want to apologize to you once, don't be angry with me. I shook my head, Grandpa, I'm not angry with you, really, wait for me, wait until I graduate from university, I'll take you with me. He smiled bitterly, didn't say anything, just held my hand tightly in his palm, not wanting to let go. The next day after the student loan was approved, I left home to enroll in school. I wanted to leave early to settle down and then find a part-time job. I needed to earn money, I needed money for tuition, I needed to pay off the debt to Tandong, and I needed money to take Grandpa to the city. I found 2 jobs, selling milk tea and working as a construction worker. I chose the second job. Construction workers can be paid by the day, and the salary is high, 300 yuan a day. Before I started school, I could work a few extra days. Every day I carried cement and painted, and I was busy without feeling tired at all. On the contrary, I felt full of enthusiasm. But I had only worked for less than 8 days when I received a call from the village chief, saying that something had happened to my grandfather. He didn't explain what it was, just urged me to go home quickly and see what happened. I asked for leave and hurriedly took the train home. All along the way, I was restless, hoping that the train would be a little faster. I thought that maybe he was just sick or had accidentally fallen while working. But unexpectedly, when I turned into the small alley, I saw the spirit flag hanging in front of the house. A terrifying premonition covered my whole body. I fell to the ground. Mac, why are you back so late? Your grandfather, he passed away last night. The village chief saw me and told me everything. My head started to buzz, it felt like something had exploded in my ears, I couldn't hear anything anymore. I staggered to my feet and walked heavily step by step towards the house, until I reached the main room. I saw a black painted coffin. In the coffin was my grandfather. I lifted the white cloth covering his face, and saw his face clearly. His face was pale, and his beard was covered with fresh blood. I trembled, touched his face, and used my sleeve to wipe the bloodstains. But the bloodstains were dry, and I couldn't wipe them off. Wake up, Grandpa, wake up quickly, it's me, Mac. The neighbors around started to pull me out. Being pulled out, I rushed forward like crazy, hugging the coffin. No matter how people pulled, I refused to let go, sobbing. Grandpa, you promised to wait for me to earn enough money, to go to the city with me, you said it but didn't keep your word. I clung to the coffin, crying miserably to the sky. The neighbors who used to hate me also had red eyes, and couldn't help but shed tears. I held an aunt's hand and asked her, my grandfather was still healthy, why did he suddenly die like that? The aunt shook her head and hesitantly said, You should go ask your mother. I didn't ask her. I knelt in the funeral home for 5 days. After hearing the rumors, I gradually understood what had happened. On the morning of my grandfather's funeral, my mother came. She was wearing mourning clothes and knelt on the cushion in front of the coffin. She cowed out 3 times, crying and complaining, banging on the coffin lid, Dad, you made me suffer so much. It's okay, if you die, but what about me? Did you think about me? Chin Dong is dead, what should I do? You said you wouldn't accept this daughter, why did you go to Chin Dong? You deliberately forced him to do it, you hurt him, you also hurt you. I suddenly raised my head, my bloodshot eyes staring at her. At that moment, I understood the reason for my grandfather's death. I stood up and knelt down in front of my mother. Before she could react, I tore off her mourning clothes, grabbed her hand, and dragged her out of the funeral home. I felt that she was not worthy of seeing my grandfather off. I had grown up, my height had increased, and my strength was not small. Pulling my mother out was not too difficult. What are you doing, you dog? I am your mother. Get out, your grandfather doesn't want to see you. I stood at the door, chasing her away. I hated her. If it weren't for her, my grandfather wouldn't have come to see Tan Dong, and wouldn't have died. Hearing me say that, her anger immediately flared up. She rushed in front of me, without saying a word, and slapped me. The sound of a slap rang out, surprising everyone around. On the contrary, I was calm. She is my mother, for the sake of giving birth to me, this slap is considered as repaying her kindness. After you beat me, get lost. After saying that, I turned around and walked into the funeral hall. But as soon as I turned around, she shouted loudly, Do you think I want to go back? He killed my first man, and now he attacks Chin Dong, intentionally forcing Chin Dong to kill him. Now the Chin family is blaming me, he is harming me. I stood still. Hearing those words, I turned around, my face cold, and quickly walked towards my mother. I looked at her, there was no warmth in my eyes. I pointed at her face, recounting all her mistakes. When I was in high school, she fell in love early, and even went out with a hooligan. Because of him, she dropped out of school, got into a fight, and made my grandmother so angry that she had a heart attack and died. My grandfather came to find her, begging her to go back to school, wanting to take her home, but what did she do? She let that scoundrel teach her grandfather a lesson. That bastard used a knife to slash her grandfather's face, so she accidentally killed him. Grandpa was sentenced to 15 years in prison, but his sentence was reduced by 2 years because of his good behavior. However, she never cared about him, and didn't even visit him once, then randomly married a coworker and had 2 children. She was unhappy because her husband earned little money, had no ability, and had an affair with Chin Dong, who had pursued her in high school. She thought that by marrying Chin Dong, she would have a good life, but she didn't expect that Chin Dong married her just to humiliate her for not accepting him before. Even his 2 houses were built by cheating her. Not only did he not care about her, he also liked to beat her. She was often beaten until she was bruised, but she didn't dare complain because she was ashamed. Grandpa couldn't bear it, and was afraid that she would be beaten to death, so he went to find Chin Dong and risked his life with him, just to protect her. You always say that your grandfather is harming you. From that scoundrel, to my father, to Chin Dong now, you always think that it was your grandfather who messed up your life, that he interfered in your life, and that's why you ended up like this. But have you ever thought about it? You yourself are the root of all your mistakes. You made mistakes but didn't admit it, and relied on your grandfather's love to constantly blame him. Your life is your life, and isn't your grandfather's life a life? You were afraid that she would go astray and accidentally kill someone, so you wasted 13 years of your life. After you got out of prison, you took care of me for 5 years. Now, because of Chin Dong's abuse, you stood up to protect her, sacrificing your own life. Everything your grandfather did was because he loved you, because you were his daughter. Then what about you? You never looked back at your mistakes, you only knew how to blame him. Having a daughter like you is the biggest mistake of my life. After saying that, I went back into the house, sat next to the closed coffin, and cried as I spoke to my grandfather. Grandpa, why are you so stupid? You did so much for your daughter, and yet you don't say anything. My grandfather would no longer answer me. Hearing those words, my mother did not scold me, nor did she scold my grandfather. The neighbors said that she cried and ran away. I didn't care. I didn't want to hear anything more about her. After burying my grandfather, I stayed at home for 2 more days before returning to school. I tried even harder. Besides studying, I only worked part-time, only in my dreams could I see my grandfather again. I woke up early in the morning, wiped the wet corners of my eyes and continued to work hard. The teacher noticed that something was wrong with me, and encouraged me to join clubs. I chose the sign language club. I didn't want to talk, silence was the most suitable thing for me. I just didn't expect that I would meet an acquaintance there. Luemo, I finally met you, I've been studying for a week and still haven't found you. Tang Lei looked at me, his eyes shining, and walked towards me. I just silently glanced at him for a moment, nodded, then ignored him, and continued to follow the seniors to learn sign language. He wasn't angry, just following behind, silently accompanying me. His mouth never stopped, and during the break, he came towards me again. Luemo, I used my Olympic gold medal to get into Tsinghua because of you. Why don't you say anything? No one here gossips about us. Are you afraid that your grandfather will beat you? Let me tell you, our family, no one beats me anymore, my grandfather is gone. My voice was cold, I calmly said, and then turned around and left. Tang Lei stood there, stunned. The smile on his face slowly disappeared, replaced by sympathy. He ran after me to apologize. I have never needed sympathy. 3 months after joining the Sign Language Club, the club organized a volunteer trip. I went to a school for the deaf with my friends. There, I met many innocent, bright children, their faces filled with bright smiles, their skillful hands conveying their inner thoughts. Looking at the children, my heart felt relieved and at peace. Listening to their dreams, I taught them extra classes, played with them, saw their innocent and bright faces, and a smile that I had not seen for a long time appeared on my face. After returning, I signed up to be a long-term volunteer. I loved those children, and being with them made me feel relieved and happy. Tang Lei also followed and signed up. After leaving the registration room, he suddenly stopped me. Luemo, I have something to tell you. I was not interested in listening. Sorry, I still have to go to work. He chased after me, his voice urgent. I know your childhood was not happy, and you did not have loving parents, but I have all of those things. I can share my joy with you. Luemo, I like you. Give me a chance. Let me be by your side to bring you joy, okay? My heart suddenly stopped, and my whole body became tense. From a young age, this was the first time someone said they liked me. But I was very clear-headed. I knew what I wanted, and I always remembered what my grandfather said. At the same time, deep down, I felt that Tang Lei and I did not belong to the same world. Someone like me did not deserve a good life. I coldly refused. I don't need it. I turned around and walked away, disappearing into the vast sea of people. Tang Lei stood still, watching my back as I left. He was not discouraged, but encouraged himself. Tang Lei, you can do it, keep up the good work. On the weekend, my construction supervisor got a new job, delivering drinks to a warehouse, earning 500 yuan a day. I followed. The warehouse was very large, there were also many drinks. I gritted my teeth and carried each box of drinks on my shoulder, one by one, moving them out. My shoulder was scratched, but I didn't care. I just applied some iodine alcohol when I got home at night and it was done. At noon, the teacher called me to stop and rest. Just as I dusted myself off and was about to get my lunchbox, I heard a loud bang from the opposite warehouse. It seemed like something had collapsed. It's not good. The pile of wine bottles fell down, hitting someone. Hurry up. Urgent shouts rang out. The people who were eating immediately put down their lunchboxes and ran to the opposite warehouse. I followed. Being a worker away from home was not easy. If someone fell down, their whole family would lose their livelihood. As soon as I entered the opposite warehouse, I smelled a strong smell of alcohol. The floor was covered with broken glass. In the middle of the broken pieces was a person lying on his back. I didn't know where he was injured. I only saw bright red blood flowing from his neck. Lu Vin Sin, it's Lu Vin Sin, save him. Hearing the familiar yet unfamiliar name Lu Vin Sin, I was stunned, standing there frozen. It wasn't until the bloody man in the warehouse was carried out that I saw through his red face and recognized his appearance. He was older, with more wrinkles. But I still recognized him immediately. It was my father. Dad! I shouted in surprise. I went to the hospital with my father in the ambulance. On the critical notice, the doctor asked for a relative to sign. I hesitated for a moment and then signed my name. We hadn't seen each other for 5 years, and this time we met again in such a situation. Even though I didn't have much affection for him, he was still my father after all, and I was still worried about him when he was going to die. I paid the hospital bill for him, my palms clenched, my heart was restless, and tears blurred my eyes. When the doctor came out, I begged him to save my father. Now, all I had left was my father. The patient has lost too much blood, he needs a blood transfusion. The blood from the blood bank is on the way, but it will take another half hour. I couldn't wait, I couldn't let my father wait. Take my blood, doctor, I'm his daughter, use my blood. I stretched out my arm, wanting to save my father. The doctor looked at me, looking a little worried. I am old enough, in good health, doctor, please take my blood. I cried and begged. The doctor nodded in agreement. I followed the nurse to take the blood. But 5 minutes later, the nurse gave me news that I could not accept. Lumac, your blood type is A, and Levin Sin is O, your blood cannot be used. I was stunned, feeling that the nurse had made a mistake. Impossible, nurse, please check again, how could my father be O, did you check wrongly? I knew my mother was O blood type. When she had a difficult birth of my younger brother, I heard the nurse say that when she transfused her blood. There is no mistake, we can only wait for blood from the center. After the nurse finished speaking, she turned and left. I stood there, my whole body in shock. At that moment, I began to doubt my identity. Who am I after all? Could it be that I am not my parents' biological child? Thinking of this, I suddenly understood everything. No wonder they were always cold to me. No wonder my mother always called me a dog, my father rarely came home. It turned out that I was adopted. I suddenly felt relieved. If they were not my biological parents, there was nothing wrong with not raising me. I sat in the hallway all afternoon. By evening, Levin Sin woke up. He lost a lot of blood, the wound on his chest was quite deep, but fortunately he was out of danger. I bought some porridge and brought it into the ward. Eat something, the nurse said that for the next 2 days, you can only eat liquids. I set up a small table and placed a bowl of porridge in front of him. He glanced at me, his eyes full of scrutiny and indifference. I knew the reason, and I no longer felt sad, pretending not to see it. After all, I had called him father for more than 10 years, taking care of him for a few days was no big deal. Get out! His voice was cold, full of annoyance. I didn't leave, only reminded him, Hao-Ran is still in middle school, Dad still has to lie down for 3 days and can't go out, are you sure you want to chase me away? Lu Hao-Ran was my younger brother. I was the one who took care of him since he was little, and he was also the most pampered child in the family. Hearing his younger brother mentioned, he didn't say anything more, lowered his head and obediently started eating porridge. At night, I slept on a chair in the hallway, wearing my work clothes during the day to spend the night. The next day, a few colleagues came to visit him. Knowing that I was his daughter, they all praised me for being filial, saying that when I heard that something had happened to him, I cried like rain. Li Yongxing looked at me, not saying anything, his eyes seemed to soften a little. I stayed in the hospital for 3 days. On the 3rd day, when the doctor allowed him to get out of bed, I said,
"Goodbye."
To him, I'm leaving now. I've already paid 5,000 yuan in hospital fees for Dad. The order slip for the hospital canteen is in the drawer. Dad, call and order it yourself. After saying that, I was about to leave. Mo. He called me back. I turned my head to look at him. This man, I used to think he was my biological father. Even though he never cared about me, I didn't know the taste of fatherly love, but all these years, he has always been in my heart as a father. Now, knowing that he is not my biological father, I don't know how to face him. He seemed to notice the distance in my eyes, and lowered his eyes. There is one thing, you probably don't know. I know, I am not your biological child. I tried to act like I didn't care. His eyes suddenly widened. No, I am your mother's biological child. I didn't understand, so I jokingly asked, you mean she made you wear the green hat? Other than that, I couldn't think of any other possibility. Levin Sin shook his head, then told me a story. My mother was very good at studying in high school, but her friends were jealous, so they found a bunch of hooligans to bully her. Among them, there was a hooligan who saw that mother and child were beautiful, so he saved her. Not long after, she ran away from home to follow him and even secretly dropped out of school. When your grandfather found out, she was already more than 3 months pregnant. Because of that, your grandmother had a heart attack and died of anger. Your grandfather went to that hooligan's house, forced your mother to come back, and forced her to break up with him. Your mother refused and even wanted to marry him. Your grandfather was so angry that he slapped her. The hooligan then took a machete from the house and slashed your grandfather's face. Your grandfather accidentally killed him and was imprisoned. At that time, your father had just returned from afar and met your mother. She did not ask for a dowry and agreed to marry your father, but after your father married her, he found out that she was pregnant. Hearing this, I was stunned. My whole body felt like hot blood was rushing to the top of my head. My mind was blank, staring at Levin Sin. I understood. I was the child in her belly that year. No wonder, for all these years, he did not like to come home. No wonder, everyone did not like me. No wonder, your grandfather hated me so much at first. No wonder, later, he suddenly apologized and said words of regret to me. No wonder, everyone called me a dog, a mongrel. It turned out that I came to this world like this. I did not know how I left the hospital. When I returned to school, I was still in a daze. It was already dark. I stood under the dormitory, my whole body trembling. Mo, you're finally back. Where have you been these past few days? Tang Lei was standing below the dormitory. When he saw me, he immediately ran over. Looking at his bright face, I thought of my own filthy background, someone who was hated by everyone like a rat, and suddenly burst out laughing. A bitter, painful laugh. I pulled Tang Lei's sleeve, like a drunkard, and said to him, "You know, I'm a bastard, a dog. I don't even want a dog. I shouldn't have been born." Tang Lei saw me like this, and was a little confused. "What's wrong with you? What happened? Mo, don't scare me. I'm a dog, I shouldn't have been born. I didn't want her to give birth to me. Why did she treat me like this?" I screamed and yelled, then suddenly burst into tears. It was the first time Tang Lei saw me like this. He always thought I was a good, quiet person, with a somewhat lonely personality, only knowing how to study. Now seeing me go crazy like this, he felt both pity and sadness. He hugged me, constantly stroking my hair, feeling my body tremble, taking off his coat and covering me. He didn't ask what happened, didn't say anything, just silently hugged me, kept hugging me until I stopped crying completely. The next morning when I woke up, my eyes were swollen like peaches. I still lived as if nothing had happened, continuing my 3-point life, studying, canteen, part-time job. Tang Lei was still by my side. He was no longer as chattering as before, but silently followed me. Whatever I did, he did too. I chased him away, he just smiled and refused, then continued to follow me. Seeing that I couldn't control him, I ignored him. Until one day, more than half a month later, Tang Lei suddenly stopped coming. It seemed that I had gotten used to his presence, so I felt a little absent. However, 2 days later, I quickly got used to it again. The person I loved the most, my grandfather, was gone. There was no one in this world for me to miss anymore. Studying and working were everything to me. But what surprised me was that a week later, Tang Lei appeared before me again. This time, he appeared with a girl. The girl patted his arm, the two of them smiling, looking very happy. I walked around them. Mo. He called out to me, stepping in front of me, with a serious expression. "I went to see Levin Sin, and learned about your background." I didn't want to listen, so I turned around and left. He pulled my hand back. "Although I can't fully feel your pain, I know that you have lived a very miserable life these past years, more miserable than I could imagine. I won't force you to be with me. I just hope that you can give me a chance to stay by your side, take care of you, and accompany you." I looked at him, thinking of that scumbag father I had never met. He had ruined my mother's youth, ruined my grandfather's life, and even caused my grandmother to die. I don't dare trust any man. I don't need it. I pulled my hand away. The girl beside him suddenly walked over, grabbed my hand. The bright smile on her face was like an exquisite porcelain doll. "Sister-in-law, it's okay if you don't like my brother, but I like you. Let's play together in the future, okay?" I looked at her and realized that she and Tang Lei had some similarities. Tang Lei introduced, "This is my twin sister, Tang Lu." Tang Lu was a talkative person. Without waiting for me to refute, she pulled my hand and said, "Sister-in-law, I like you very much. We met by fate, let's be best friends in the future." Every day, she followed Tang Lei to find me, even asked to move into the same dormitory as me. She told me strange stories, told me about her and her brother's trips, told me about fun things at home, and even took me to meet her grandparents. Perhaps because I had no friends since I was young, after spending some time with Duonglu, I started to like her. I listened to all the stories she told. Especially when I learned that she and Duongloi had traveled to more than 20 countries, I started to dream of exploring strange places. I felt like I was back to the days when I lived with my grandfather, so happy. During the 4 years of university, thanks to Duonglu, my life became more colorful. During the winter break before graduation, I went back to my hometown to visit my grandfather. Tang Lu went with me. Tang Lei shamelessly followed along. The old bungalow had started to leak, and the yard was full of weeds. Even the yellow dog I asked the neighbor to take care of didn't seem to recognize me. It didn't bark when it saw me. I stood in the yard, pointed at the old dog cage, and said to Tang Lu, "The first day I came to my grandfather's house, I was here." Thinking back, I didn't feel miserable, but rather, I felt amused. I felt that I was really clever that day, using a trick to force my grandfather to let me into the house. Thinking back, I realized how heartbroken my grandfather was. Clearly, I was the enemy's child. He had endured all the pain, silently enduring it alone. Tang Lu hugged me, crying heartbrokenly. Tang Lei didn't say anything, turned around and went to pull weeds in the yard. After clearing the grass, I bought some wine, brought some cakes, and went to my grandfather's grave. I knelt in front of his tombstone, burned some paper, and said, "Grandpa, I miss you." "Do you miss me?" "Grandpa, I'm about to graduate. I've completed the study task you gave me." I knelt in front of his grave for more than an hour, saying the words from the bottom of my heart for the whole year. Only when my legs were numb did Tang Lu help me up. When I returned home, I found that there were workers repairing inside. "What's going on?" A middle-aged couple was directing the workers, and when they heard the noise, they turned around. The man helped the woman out and stood in front of me. "Mom and Dad, why are you here too?" Tang Lu ran over, put her arm around her mother, and leaned her head on her shoulder. The woman stroked her cheek, then walked closer to me, and held my hand affectionately. "You are Momo, right? I am Loi Loi and Lily's mother. I heard you two say you wanted to go back to your hometown with you, so I came along to see how your hometown was. I didn't expect this house to be dilapidated. I called my workers to help fix it. I won't bother you, right?" I was stunned, and looked down at the woman's warm hand holding mine, feeling an indescribable warmth. "Thank you, ma'am," I said. "It's nothing. My 2 children talk about you all the time." The man nodded. "As long as the house is still there, the hometown is still there. After fixing the house, you will feel more secure." I thanked again, not knowing what else to say. While I was confused, Duonglu pulled my hand and said, "What are you thanking me for? My parents are also your parents. From now on, we will be family." Hearing that, Duong Loi raised his head and gave his thumbs up to his sister. Duong's parents also looked at their son with encouraging eyes. With the help of Tang's parents, the old house was repaired in 2 days. Looking at the neat and tidy house, I smiled happily. The day I left my hometown, I went to my grandfather's grave to say
goodbye.
I couldn't bear to let go of the tombstone, promising that if I had time next year, I would come back to visit him. Turning around, I saw Tang Loi holding a bouquet of roses standing in front of me. I was stunned, not knowing what to do. He suddenly knelt down in front of my grandfather's grave. "Grandpa, I like Momo, I've liked her for 5 years. From the first time I saw her, I felt that she was very special. She made me understand that happiness is not easy. I was always immersed in it without knowing how to cherish it. She is strong and brave, like a weed growing in the mud, but she never complained. On the contrary, she courageously faced all challenges. I like her, but I know that in her heart you are still the most important, and I also know that she doesn't have a sense of security. So today, I want to stand before you as a witness, hoping that Momo will give me a chance, accept me. I swear that in this life, I will only love Momo, treat her well, protect and respect her. If I do anything wrong, I swear I will be unhappy." Saying the last words, I stepped forward and covered Tang Lei's mouth. His life doesn't just include me, but also his parents and the younger sister he loves. How could he swear such an oath for me? Tang Lei held my hand, placed it on his cheek, and gently kissed my hand. "Momo, give me a chance, okay?" I looked at my grandfather's tombstone. A gust of wind blew by, blowing away the burnt yellow papers. I seemed to hear his voice. He softly called me, saying that I had grown up, and should decide my own life. I nodded, giving Tang Lei a chance. He jumped up with joy, picked me up, and spun me around a few times. I wrapped my arms around his neck, laughing. After the new year, we returned to school. Around me, there were friends who continued their studies for graduate school, some who started working and received several good job offers. Tang Lei asked me, "Do you have any plans? Whether you continue your studies or work, I support you." I stood up, looked out the window at the big world and said, "I want to go to a school for the deaf to be a teacher." This was not a spur-of-the-moment decision, but a careful thought after more than 3 years of volunteering. Okay. Tang Lei fully supported me. When they learned that I wanted to be a teacher at a special school, the teachers and friends around me were all surprised. Everyone thought that I had worked hard to get into a prestigious school, and that I shouldn't have chosen such a job with no future. I told them, the future is what others judge me for, and what I want is peace of mind. My childhood was full of misfortune, and I didn't want these children to follow in my footsteps. Moreover, when I was with them, I was truly happy. Tang's parents supported me and even bought a house in Beijing for Tang Lei and me. What surprised me even more was that only my name was on the land title. I felt both loved and surprised. Tang Lei secretly told me, "Your parents did this because they were afraid that you would lack a sense of security. From now on, the house will be under your name. If your brother dares to treat you badly, you can just kick him out empty-handed." Tang Lei heard this and immediately grabbed his sister's collar, intending to throw her out. "Are you my real sister?" "No, I'm your sister-in-law's real sister. You two are so close now, you should thank me. If it weren't for me, you wouldn't have such a good sister-in-law." Tang Lei was unconvinced. Tang Lu snorted and stomped on his foot. "How shameless, you asked me to help you chase her. You should thank me because it was thanks to your intelligence and cleverness that I was able to marry a beauty." The two argued for a long time and then fought. I watched the scene, laughing non-stop, my eyes filled with admiration. In my 3rd year of work, Tang Lei proposed to me. Our wedding was simple. I had no relatives, the only guests were my students. That day, after the MC's enthusiastic introduction, Tang Lei and I exchanged rings. Just as we were about to kiss, an uninvited guest barged in. She barged into the wedding hall, pointing at me in front of everyone and cursing. "You ungrateful dog, are you hiding from your mother? I am your mother, why don't you support me, why don't you give me money? Today I have to show everyone what an ungrateful son you are." It had been a long time since I heard anyone curse me like that. The 3 words, "you son of a bitch," seemed to activate a memory button, bringing back many painful memories. Looking at the arrogant woman in front of me, even from a distance, I still recognized her as my mother. My face became ugly. She started to accuse me in front of everyone in the Tang family. Knowing that she was my mother, my in-laws stood up and wanted to stop her. But my mother was not a person who could reason, and they were unable to stop her at all. She cursed more and more horribly, from me to my grandfather. I couldn't stand it anymore. Tang Lei knew that my grandfather was a taboo for me, so he pulled my hand back. "Mo, don't touch me, let me handle it." He got down and walked in front of her. "You always say you're Mo's mother, but when she needed you the most, you abandoned her, got married, and left her in the care of your grandfather." The banquet hall began to whisper. My mother didn't even listen to Tang Lei, and continued to curse me as ungrateful, a dog, a mongrel, saying that I was evil to the core, that I shouldn't have been born in the first place, and that my younger brother and I were both unfilial. At that moment, my heart turned cold. Not letting Duonglu stop me, I walked in front of her. "Are you done talking?" She choked. "Give me 50,000, then give me 4,000 every month, and I'll go." My eyes left her and looked at the security guards nearby. "Excuse me, kick this crazy woman out." My mother cursed and was thrown out. My wedding was completely ruined by her. Everyone started gossiping about me. My parents-in-law were busy explaining. Tang Lei was by my side comforting me. Tang Lei went on stage, took the MC's microphone, faced all my friends and relatives, and loudly declared, Mo is my wife. What kind of person she is none of your turn to judge. Whoever dares to say another word about her, don't blame me, Tang Lei, you've turned your back." The audience immediately fell silent. My tears blurred. It felt so wonderful to be protected by someone. When I returned home, I leaned on Tang Lei's shoulder, listening to him comfort me. Mo, even if the sky falls, I'm here, don't be afraid. Let me take care of your mother. I closed my eyes, enjoying his concern, and nodded slightly. Okay. No one likes to be strong, the so-called strong, is just a last resort. I am very lucky to have met Duong Loi, to have met the Duong family. From now on, I don't need to be strong anymore. I don't ask how Duong Loi handled that. I don't want to hear about unimportant people and things anymore. I know Duong Loi will protect me, will arrange everything best for me. Right now, I just want to live my life peacefully. Peace and quiet is the greatest happiness. End.